lot about the trifecta of new federal funding initiated by President Biden and passed under the last Congress that provides about $3 trillion with a T in funding and financial incentives to build the new net zero climate resilient infrastructure that we need. This is funding that replaces the roads and bridges in such disrepair that they're collapsing in extreme weather and were rated dangerous by the rating agencies. This is funding that is going to clean energy innovations to build a new energy infrastructure. I mean, this is truly transformative for a 21st century economy. But where is that funding going? Like, really, who is tracking it? What do those investments mean for the type of energy we'll have in the future? When will we have it? Where are the opportunities? Well, lucky for us, we're going to find out today from a very special guest who is literally overseeing much of the Department of Energy's allocations of these resources. So pull out your notebook and pen or tablet and prepare to take some notes. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast. We share stories, insights, tips, and advice from remarkably innovative women working on the front lines of corporate responsibility, energy, sustainability, and ESG-related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, leadership, technologies, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, on our website, of course, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes blog as well. And please pass it on to your friends and leave us a 5-star review if you're so inclined. It helps other people find us. Just a quick note, if you are at an inflection point yourself, looking for support for your work or your career, we're going to talk about a lot of opportunities here, but if you need some help, reach out to me on Twitter and let me know, no matter what industry you're in. So you've likely heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. Together, they total about $3 trillion of investment in the U.S. infrastructure, roads, bridges, highways, broadband, and in energy and energy infrastructure. We are transforming, yay, for the 21st climate neutral, net zero, climate resilient economy. It includes about $7 billion for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for example, about $3 billion for advanced vehicle manufacturing. It includes about $100 million to upgrade NOAA, where we get our forecasting for the weather from, about $6 billion to build out the new clean energy supply chain that we desperately need, and so much, 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 much more. But where's it going? What are we getting for these investments and of our tax dollars, and how is that money being tracked? Who is picking the lucky businesses and institutions that get the funding? Well, let's find out from the woman making a lot of these decisions. Lucky for us. I'd like you to meet Dr. Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer of the U.S. Department of Energy. She's also the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions, where her work includes, I think, overseeing the 17 national labs, which are remarkable places in themselves. She brings a really, really unique combination of experiences to this influential role. She's been a researcher in academia, an investor, a partner at McKinsey for 13 years, by the way, where she ran their innovation practice as well as advised top companies. And I might add, was the first woman and first East Asian elected partner in McKinsey in their North American chemicals practice. So that's pretty cool. She also did the entrepreneurial thing herself, having invented, I can't believe this, products that were sold on QVC and featured on the Today Show. I mean, like, come on. And on top of it all, she's a renowned professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Vanessa earned her PhD in material science and engineering from MIT and her bachelor's degree in material science and engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. So I guess she's back teaching at her alma mater when she's not at the DOE. Wow. I could go on forever. So many questions. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Chan to Electric Ladies Podcast. Thank you. Welcome, Vanessa.
I'm so thrilled to be here, and I love the name of your podcast, and it is an honor to be joining you here. And in my role here as Chief Commercialization Officer, I'm not making the decisions, but I'm helping to inform the decisions of the dollars going out the door, and I'm helping our 17 national labs commercialize their technologies. So just want to make sure if my colleagues are listening, they're like, oh my gosh, Vanessa's not doing it all on her own. It takes an entire team of DOE and colleagues to get all this stuff done.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure you guys have hundreds and maybe thousands of people there. I've known many of them over the years. So touche, and thank you for clarifying. So let's start with the primer on the funding that DOE has to allocate. Give us, I mean, I know that there's 80 bazillion numbers that you can't possibly have memorized, but give us a short version of kind of what pockets of money the DOE has to spread around and the types of technologies it can go to based on the legislation, because you're limited by what's in those. I mean, it's a lot of money, but you're still limited by the wording of the legislation.
So at the highest level, there is $62 billion that's going towards DOE through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then at the high level, again, for the Inflation Reduction Act, there's $369 billion to modernize the U.S. energy system. And really kind of what we are looking to do is to deliver a more equitable, clean future, to expand access to energy efficiency and clean energy for families and communities, deliver reliable, clean, affordable power to more Americans, build technologies of tomorrow through clean energy demonstrations. And so really, as you are alluding to there's a lot of clean energy technologies that are underpinning all of this, and includes things like clean hydrogen, advanced nuclear, virtual power plants, carbon capture and sequestration, and so forth. And really what we're trying to do is use the money that we have to catalyze the private sector to be acting. And I think this is a very, very important, because in the end, when you think about commercialization, it's actually not one single entity that commercializes. It's an entire ecosystem, which includes private sector as being the most important part of it. Because you mentioned the 3 trillion that include not just energy, but other things. If you look at just the clean energy side of it, it's probably more like $1 trillion. We have to use that trillion to buy down the risk of the 30 trillion that the private sector has. So in the end, it's the 30 trillion that we're going after, and really trying to get the private companies to kind of write checks, to deploy capital, to make all this stuff happen. And I think it's a really important framing of how we think about this $1 trillion. And the theme across all of this clean energy transition, it is private sector led, but government enabled. So we as a government are trying to enable the private sector to move faster so we can meet our very ambitious goals, which includes a 50% reduction from 2005 levels of greenhouse gas pollution by 2030, a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035, and a net zero emissions economy by 2050.
Wow, I love the big, hairy, audacious goals, which is why I got my MBA, but those are truly amazing. So I have 800 questions from that, but
only 800?
Only 800. Yeah, right. Well, we only have an hour. So what?
I'll talk fast.
Yeah, exactly. I really like this framing. I mean, I've worked mostly in the private sector, my whole life. I've done some government work, in fact, with DOE on helping them get more women to apply for SBIR loans, or grants. But how is that, when you say it's private sector led but government enabled, does the private sector then help you decide where the money is allocated? I mean, I know you're you're responding to proposals for the money, right? And those are coming from private entities. So to a degree, they're doing it through the proposals, I gather. But are you turning to the private sector, to funders like your former employers at Vanguard and others, or whoever, VCs, and saying, what would you invest in? Or how are you deciding even the categories? You mentioned carbon sequestration and nuclear, et cetera, and power plants, clean power plants, virtual power plants, I think is in there too. So how does that dialogue happen?
Great question. And so I kind of want to unpack this quite a bit in terms of the nested questions that you have. So I think, first of all, in terms of how to prioritize which dollars that we had, or technologies that we had to go after first, was really kind of dictated by the laws and where the money was. So if you take a look what came through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, many of the technologies were mentioned there. And so we were focusing on that because those were the dollars we had to get out the door. Now, I think it's important as framing for your listeners to explain a little bit the background of commercialization, and then I'll answer the questions of how the private sector and the public sector need to link together. And it's based on kind of my 20 plus years of experience of trying to help private sector companies that are spending billions of dollars on R&D figure out how to bring it to the marketplace. So I think the first thing I wanted to level set all this on is, what is commercialization? It's one of those squishy words that means different things to different people. And so as the chief commercialization officer, I thought was very important. One of the first things I wanted to do was make sure everyone at DOE was on the same page of what is commercialization. And what I've heard too much when I was in the private sector were people saying we do R&D and then we commercialize. And if you define it that way, you will never bring things to market, because what's happening is you're doing technology push. Research scientists, I have a PhD in engineering, so I, think of myself as one of those, are trained through our PhDs to be technology push. You do research in an area which everyone in your research group does. So you follow a professor that does research in one technology, and every single PhD thesis coming out is related to that technology. So you're groomed for 5 years to think that technology is the most important thing. And you're never asked the question, what is it that you're trying to solve as a problem? Instead, you're trying to figure out something complicated about the technology that you can do. And then the last thing that you do when you get your PhD is you defend your PhD, which is a terrible verb. Because if you're trying to really commercialize something, you have to be listening to the market and not be defensive. Anyone who's invested in startups knows a defensive entrepreneur is a terrible entrepreneur, because they're not listening to cues of what's going on. And I think the other challenge with classically trained PhD, which many of us are who are doing R&D, is that we are told, don't talk to people about your research because you want to publish first. And if you talk to people about your research, then you might get scooped and you don't get the first paper publication out the door on this topic. And so there's kind of like an entire culture around the way in which we're trained for our PhDs, which actually in many ways is anti-commercialization, because we need to actually understand the market issues and then ask the question, what's the technology that could solve that? So it's really important you think about commercialization is that it is a continuum where you start at research, you move to development, you then move to demonstration, and then you move to deployment. And it's the R, D, D, and D continuum. And it would be wonderful. It's linear where we go R, D, D, and D. It's not. It's like a game of chutes and ladders. You may get to a certain point in the demonstration phase, find something out, and then you're back to the beginning because something didn't work. But it's really important that it's a continuum so that the market is at the very last on the kind of outside of it, and that there's constantly having input into the research, development, demonstration, deployment continuum, so that as we're doing movement across that, as technology is moving, there is insight in terms of what is it going to take to bring something to market. Now, traditionally, the way in which many companies and the private sector and the public sector think about technology maturation is through something called technology readiness levels. And these were invented by NASA in order to launch spaceships to the moon. And that is not something which is sufficient in order to drive to full-scale deployment. So to make it to the very end, because when you're trying to commercialize something, it's not just the technology you have to get right. It's things like, what is the customer willing to pay for it? Do you have the value chain set up? All these kinds of things which you don't need if you're going to be launching 4 or 5 rockets with the same design. And so what we needed to do here was bring the private sector thinking in. And that's what I mean by private sector led, is to really understand what would it take for the private sector to be willing to invest capital so that these technologies are actually be able to be used by us. And so there's something very deliberate that I did when I was here thinking about this, was how do we actually get everyone aligned? The private sector and the public sector. And there's, a couple of inspirations that I had when I was thinking about this. One was Gordon Moore, who was the founder of Intel. had predicted that we need to double the number of transistors on a chip every 2 years in order for us to get to the processing speeds that we needed so that we can have all this fancy technology. So, I can do a Zoom conversation like this. And in order to do that, he realized that he had to get the entire ecosystem on the same page, including competitors, of how they were going to innovate the CMOS process in order to get there. And so Semitech, which was a government-led consortia, put together a roadmap of all the things that different players had to do in order to have Moore's Law become the reality. And it worked incredibly well. And you actually can go and look up all the beautiful curves and things that were done to actually show that Moore's Law happened. Another time was with the Manhattan Project, when the US caucused in a very quick way to do something in a very short period of time. And so kind of the question I had was, how do we do that again, but aim it to clean energy? And so what we did was we pulled together a team across the Department of Energy that was quarterbacked by the Office of Technology Transitions, and in partnership with the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and the Loan Program Office, we looked to create pathways to commercial liftoff. And as the Chief Commercialization Officer and the Director of OTT, I'm the steward of the RD&D continuum. And that is why I was a quarterback for this. And I report to the secretary, which gives me a sense of what is going on across the entire enterprise. And these pathways to commercial liftoff were meant to show the other things that we need to get right in addition to technology for us to reach liftoff. And so we started these in September of 2022, and we focused on 4 technologies in the first wave. It was hydrogen, it was long duration energy storage, we had advanced nuclear and carbon management. And that was by design because those 4 had the most money coming out the door from Bill and Ira. So we wanted to make sure that the ecosystem and we were on the same page of what are the problems that we have to tackle. And we did a ton of private sector interviews, right, to really understand what some of the challenges are, and then pulled together a very rigorous pathway report, which you can find off at liftoff.energy.gov. That's liftoff.energy.gov.
Yes, you repeated about 12 times.
Over and over again.
Yes.
Yeah, and I will keep repeating it. But that really shows you what we're trying to do is to align everybody, the private sector and the public sector, on all the things we have to get right in order to get to that full-scale deployment. And that's what I mean by private sector led, is ultimately the private sector has to be the one that is going to be writing their much bigger checks than we have and deploying the technologies. So unless they write those $30 trillion worth of checks to deploy it, then it's not going to happen. And what we need to do is the money and equities that we've gotten is to help enable the private sector to do that.
Okay, great. That's a really good summation. So a couple of points. One is, how do you, one of the things you've talked a lot about is adoption risk, right? And I've had my own experience with adoption risk, even when I was in at Chrysler, when I led the communications and co-led sales and marketing in the electric car division. This was several years ago, before EVs had reached even the adoption they are now, and we're still struggling with adoption, right? So it's much better, and the incentives in the IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure for that will help a lot. But there's even if the private sector puts in that 30 trillion, if nobody buys it and nobody uses those technologies, and the real estate developers don't put them in their new buildings or retrofit their buildings, or the consumers don't buy these electric vehicles, etc., it's a tree falling in the forest that nobody hears, right? So how is DOE helping companies that you're funding in their commercialization process so that they increase the likelihood of adoption? Because you talk about understanding the market and in effect following the puck where it's going, to use Wayne Gretzky's analogy. But how are you helping them figure that out, and are they receptive?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's really important to get on the same page in terms of what are the challenges that you have to overcome. So some of the things that you had just highlighted was, what if people don't buy it, right? What if people aren't installing it? And so we created something at OTT called the adoption readiness levels, which is based on decades of experience that I've had around how do we really need to commercialize technologies, and what do we have to worry about besides the technology itself. And so there's 17 dimensions, which may seem a lot, but it's actually a pretty easy tool to use. You can find it on the OTT website. But those 17 dimensions are bucketed into 4 areas. One is the value proposition. So this new technology that you have, does it have the functionality that the market desires or the customer wants? And is at a price point where customers are willing to pay for that new functionality? And that is really important because if you can't demonstrate why the function is important and it's too expensive so people can't pay for it, to your point, it'll never take off. The next thing we have to worry about is market acceptance. So that's the second category of dimensions. And really it's understanding the market characteristics and the risks posed by existing players, including competitors, customers, and other value chain players. Because oftentimes when a new technology comes, the antibodies can come up to attack it, because especially some of the larger companies that have incumbent technology may not want to be thinking about new technologies because they're comfortable in their current business model. So
they don't want to have their market cannibalized by this new kid on the block.
Exactly. And so you talked about electric vehicles, which is, a case in point where the electric vehicles were invented decades ago, right? But the market was not open to this, right? We had issues with getting the supply chain there and all that put together. And so that's where the market acceptance wasn't there, even though the technology was working. And then the third category is around resource maturity, which is there capital available? Is there money available to finance a lot of this? Do we have the supply chain that we need to actually build it out? Do we have the workforce? And there are so many instances where a lot of that stuff wasn't there, but the technology worked, and that's why the technologies couldn't be brought to market. And finally, the last category is a license to operate. So what is the regulatory environment? What about permitting and siting? What about the community perception? So there's a lot of things. You'll notice none of these things talk about the technology itself and the technology milestones, but they are things that impeded many of the examples that you just talked about that prevented those things from going to market. So what we did was, through the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, we examined all these adoption risks and articulated what they were and really tried to understand what is going to prevent these things from coming to market. And in some cases, like you talked about, there is always the chicken and egg situation, which I've found in many technologies, where the supply chain will not set itself up until they have an offtake agreement. In other words, someone is guaranteed to buy their stuff. The people who buy things don't want to sign an offtake agreement until they know the supply chain is stable and ready to go. So everybody sits there waiting for the other one to move. And the other challenge, which I always find with new technologies, is everyone is first in line to be the fourth or fifth player to do it. No one is first in line to be the first or second. And so everyone's kind of standing behind the other, trying to push the other one forward. And so one of the things that we've done, for example, in hydrogen hubs, was there was $8 billion allocated to hydrogen hubs through the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. $7 billion of that was recently announced for hydrogen hubs across the country, but $1 billion of that has been saved. And right now there is a notice of intent to take that $1 billion to help catalyze the demand side of the equation. So the hydrogen hubs are the supply side. Now the demand side and the offtake agreements also have to be catalyzed. And so we are looking at what that mechanism could look at like. It's still early days, but those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do here, is catalyze. But once again, government enabled means we're trying to catalyze the private sector who do not want to move fast and are waiting for their friends to move first, but none of their friends are moving. So we need to egg them along to get them there.
So you're reducing. It's interesting because government is typically, the funding from government usually is to reduce the technical risk so private capital can come in. You're doing that, but it sounds like you're also helping to reduce the adoption risk by making them, first of all, allocating capital to help with that adoption, which is unique, but also to help the entities getting the funding make sure that they have a plan for commercialization that is viable and can actually be executed. And that's very interesting because most, unless you have an investor who's, very active, they don't do that. You mentioned supply chain, and I'll try to resist the 80 zillion questions I have, but one of the critical ones is on critical minerals. So minerals are obviously required for all of the above, right? And a lot of them come from lousy neighborhoods, to put it gently. Russia, parts of conflict areas in Africa, etc. And there's been some effort to have some like lithium properties here, businesses and manufacturing plants in the West, for example. But what is the DOE doing with some of this money to address that critical piece? Because without those minerals, a lot of this other stuff can't really happen. It's a thread that has to be pulled.
Yep. So, and in fact, supply chain is one of the dimensions that we have in the adoption readiness levels because it is so critical to what we need to build at. And to your point, critical minerals is a key part of it. So there was actually an executive order on America's supply chains that came out a month after we had all started. So I started with day one with President Biden, and February 24th of 2021, there's an EO. So you actually can go and look at the Department of Energy's website where there was 13 papers written around different supply chains and what is required in order for us to build these out. OTT, my office, created one on commercialization and competitiveness and laid out kind of the different approaches that you need to take around how to decide whether or not something should be manufactured in the US. We also have so one of the things also to back up for your listeners is the DOE right now is very different than the DOE when I joined 2.5 years ago. And the reason why it is extremely different is that when I first joined, we had an undersecretary for research and innovation, and we had the NNSA administrator. And there, since then, has been a brand new undersecretary stood up, which is the undersecretary for infrastructure. And the reason why this is important is the undersecretary for research and innovation really focused more on research and development. And the undersecretary for infrastructure focused on demonstration and deployment. And if you remember, RDD&D is the pathway to commercialization. So now underneath the undersecretary for infrastructure, who's David Crane, there are a slew of brand new offices that are focused just on demonstration and deployment. So the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, the Loan Programs Office, which is not a new office, but it's one that's been revitalized under this administration. There's the Grid Deployment Office. There's also the Manufacturing, Energy, and Supply Chain Office that is focused just on supply chains and these kinds of things. And so it's a very different DOE because we are very focused now on the latter part of commercialization continuum. And if you've ever heard the secretary speak, she always says, deploy, deploy, deploy. That is what we're focused on. And that was not the way we were set up when I first joined. And we didn't have the bipartisan infrastructure law. We didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it's almost like we have this perfect alignment right now with the right kinds of people, the right kinds of funding, and the right kinds of conversations happening. And there's quite a few of us that bring really rich private sector experience to the table. As you mentioned, I was a partner at McKinsey & Company, and so spent a lot of time in the private sector. David Crane also comes from private sector. Jigar Shah does as well. The head of MESC, Julia, also does. And so many of us are bringing that thinking here. And I think it's important because we understand the market. We understand what it takes for capital to be allocated and what it takes for technologies to make it to the market. So bringing that thinking in to ensure that the money that we are getting through Bill and IRA are used in the most effective way so that we can catalyze the private sector is so critical. And so the things that we're doing on supply chain and others is really using our private sector thinking around what are the steps that need to happen so that we actually can create a supply chain that is reliable and is one that allows us to do the things that we need to do. And oftentimes it includes building a lot of assets here in the US. And so I think it's exciting that we have this type of thinking coming into DOE.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I love that. Yeah, David Crane, I think, was also at the IEA too, wasn't he, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I know Jigger. Jigger is one of the few men I had on Electric Ladies when it was called Green Connections Radio when I first launched the show. He's great.
David Turk was at the IEA, not
Oh,
David
that's
Crane.
right. I'm thinking David Turk. That's
David
right.
Turk, yeah.
Exactly. That's right. So a couple sort of practical things on technology. So I mentioned critical minerals. One of the big issues is intermittency with solar and wind, and so we need base load. We need backup and storage. So what kinds of technologies are you funding through with all of this fund money that you get to disperse that address the intermittency problem and make it so that we can scale solar and wind exponentially and have a clean source of baseload power to replace fossil fuels, which is currently the baseload power?
Yep. So great question. This is where long duration energy storage liftoff report at liftoff.energy.gov that you can find, where we lay out what's required. And the reason why long duration energy storage is really important is, as you mentioned, when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing, how do we actually store that energy so we don't have intermittency and have much more stable demand? And so there is quite a lot of work that is being done in this arena. And I don't like to pick favorites to say, this is going to win or that's going to win. But for example, hydrogen is a form of storage because you can take the wind and solar energy and actually produce hydrogen, which can then be chemically stored. There's also different types of battery technologies and all kinds of things that you can go to liftoff.energy.gov to find out. And really what we're trying to do is understand how the technologies can get to the improvements that we need to get to in order for these things to really take off. So in the case of long duration energy storage, we need to have the capital cost be cut in half, because going back to value propositions, it's important that we think about costs. And we also need to have round trip efficiency improved by 7 to 15% in this decade. And if we can get those two things to happen, then we actually have a real shot on goal for LDES, long duration energy storage, to play a real role in the grid. And the thing that's exciting about that is that you can then think about anywhere where you might not have the transmission lines, but if you have wind and the sun and you have long duration energy storage, you can become a little microgrid yourself. But the other thing I also want to say is oftentimes people think only about batteries when they think about intermittency and long duration energy storage. What I wanted to also make sure people think about is nuclear. Nuclear is also not intermittent, and so that also plays a role in this portfolio. And so I think it's really important for people to realize we need a whole entire portfolio of things. And it's not just one thing or another. We need a bunch of things. And so the first wave, we had the 4 technologies I talked about. The second wave of liftoff reports, which we just published in September and October of this year, we focused on virtual power plants, on industrial decarbonization, on chemicals refining, and on cement, because those are all really important in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is really where it's critical that we're thinking about the portfolio and suites of technologies and how all these things interplay with each other, because hydrogen actually plays a role across many of these different liftoff reports and sectors. And in the end, we need all of these things to work for us to meet our ambitious goals. So we are all running 8 million miles an hour to get us there.
Well, I love that. And that's so true. And that's what I was getting at with minerals and supply chain and stuff. And I was, going to ask you about the grid is the same thing. Obviously, my show is called Electric Ladies, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask if you have an idea of how much of this funding is going to, or if you can find out for me, to women-owned businesses, and also how many jobs it's creating that are, how many jobs it's creating, period, and then how many jobs are able to be seized by women. So if you can, I don't know if you have that data. I asked your team a little bit for some of it before we came on. They didn't know. I think they said it was a Shalonda Baker question. But if you can find out for me, because
Sure.
that's really important, because one of the things I found in the work that I did with DOE a few years ago on the SBIR program is that women were not asking for the money. They were not applying for the grants. They were not applying for the loans. They were not throwing their hat in the ring. And I tripled the number of women that applied, by the way, in 6 months, which was kind of amazing. But part of it was going to these women and using my network to say, you know, they want to give you money, do it, and overcoming their obstacles face to face. And so how are you making sure? I know the administration has Justice 40, which is 40% of the benefits of funding has to go to disadvantaged people. But I'm not just talking about disadvantaged women. I mean, there may be some wealthy women who have, you know, tremendous businesses that are applying. So how are you tracking this, and how are you figuring out, making sure that the funding goes to people who are not just the typical people who ask for it, but that people like you and me have an opportunity to know about this money and apply for it?
So first of all, I want to tell you that I think that everything always happens from the top through the leadership. And I have never worked with as many people, women in any company or organization that I've been in than in DOE. Starting at the very top, the secretary, Jennifer Granholm, lady, you know, using your electric ladies thing. You have myself as a direct report, lady. Office of Policy, Carla Frisch, also lady. Undersecretary Richmond, lady. And then to say administrator, lady. Shalonda Baker, lady. You know, and so there we are constantly surrounded by very thoughtful women. And I, you know, need to do the math on this, but I'm pretty confident that over 50% of the direct reports to the secretary are women, just based on who I see in meetings when I'm with them. So already that is very different than I think other administrations, because DOE really is a science-based organization. And as someone who spent her entire life in science-based organizations, I was shocked at how many women and amazing women that I've been interacting with. And so I think there's actually a meta question that you have buried in here, which is it's not just about energy. It is about women in general. So you can talk about it in the context of DOE and energy and the money we have, but I've been in, you know, VC settings where women are not asking for money, and it has nothing to do with energy, right? I've in academia, right? There are not a lot of women at the very, very top, even though at the bottom for engineering, the undergrad students is 50-50. By the time you get to the top, a woman of color is even less likely to be a dean. You start looking at startups themselves, like not that many women are there. So I think the meta question is more, how do we get women to step up and not be afraid to ask for what they want and not be afraid to take risks on the things that they're trying to do. And the person that I will connect you to is Bethany Jones, who's another woman. She is the new head of our Office of Clean Energy Jobs, and she reports to Carla Frisch, the Office of Policy. I do know through Bill and Ira, there's a projection of an average of 1.5 million jobs per year are going to be added over the course of the decade. And I am positive that this administration is looking at diversity of those jobs and making sure that they're good paying jobs as well, which is important because women also oftentimes get paid less for the exact same job. And so I'm confident that there's change happening because we have the right people at the top being represented.
Well, I love that. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to talking to her. So how are the dollars being tracked? And by the way, I want to find out how people can apply in a minute. And but I have one other question, and then we'll get to that. But how is DOE tracking? I mean, we don't, there's this big refrain of waste, fraud, and abuse, right? And you got $3 trillion for crying out loud. So we know there was fraud and abuse under COVID money. There's always some fraction that goes to unsavory people who, do unsavory things. So how is the DOE being diligent about tracking the money and tracking the results so that you don't just throw good money after bad, but understanding that the scientific process is, as you said, it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back a lot of the time, or sometimes it's 3 steps forward and 4 steps back, and you got to start over. So how are you tracking it, and how are you making sure that there's as little waste, fraud, and abuse as humanly possible?
Yeah, so I think the federal government actually has a lot of processes to ensure that isn't happening. So when you have funding opportunity announcement, people are applying, and uh, through those application processes, there's details around what they're doing. But once the awardees are announced, so in this case, like say the hydrogen hubs were announced, there is still an entire negotiation going on around, is that money going to be used a certain way? How are we going to track the milestones against it and all of that? And, I'm not in charge of those billions of dollars, so can't tell you the nitty gritties, but the ones who are, right, I know that there's a lot of important conversations during the negotiation period to ensure that it's clear how the money is being used, and then milestone-based decision points for that. And so I think it'd be better if you speak to someone who can tell you exactly how they're doing it, because I'm a little bit removed from that since it's not OTT's money, it's other people's money. But I have seen a lot of rigor, similar to, things like the venture capitals and other who, it's their money. They want to make sure things are being done well. And I think all of us, this is our money. I mean, my daughter had her first summer job 2 years ago, and I was helping her do her taxes. And she was like, "What is this?" I was like, "It's taxes. That's why you don't get your, $15 an hour in full." And she's like, "Where's it go?" And I was like, to the government. She's like, "Wait, am I paying your salary?" I was like, "Yes, you are." She's like, "Wait, am I your boss?" I was like, "We're just going to stop it right there." So, I think many of us are parents, and we're like, this is our kids' summer internship money, right? That is being used to fund these things, and it better be done in the right way. And so I really think all of us are aligned around wanting to make sure that this money is having the impact it needs to have. Otherwise, I can't look my kid in the eye, even though she's not my boss, of what the money's going to.
No, I appreciate that. I knew someone who would say every time they write a check for their taxes, they think about all the people that they're helping. So I thought that was a good way to look at it. How would somebody who's listening has some great technology that they are now inspired by you? How would they apply? Where do they go? Where do they start to even figure? I mean, there's like 200 different categories or whatever it is of places of types of technologies and stuff. So where do they start?
Well, the DOE website has an exchange where we post the funding opportunity announcements as they're coming, or any notice of intent for money that's coming out the door. So I think that's where you should start. I will say I've been intrigued. I've met a couple of startups that actually are using AI and machine learning to help companies like this figure out where money is, not just from DOE, but across the web, and help them then apply to that funding using AI and machine learning. So I would also encourage your readers to look into, there's like little startup starting around helping to navigate, because there's just so much going on. It's hard to keep track of all of it. But if you really, want to manually start, you start at the DOE website and look for the funding opportunity announcements. But as I mentioned, there's these companies out there that are really trying to help folks like that who don't have the time or bandwidth to be checking this all the time.
Well, I appreciate that. And are these, I mean, like the SBIR grant applications, therefore, they're very specific for specific technique. We're looking for a hydrogen nozzle to fit on, a hydrogen plant that's X size. I mean, they're pretty wildly specific. The National Science Foundation ones has more general categories, but the DOEs are very specific. But what if you have a technology that you think would fit into this, but you don't know where?
Yeah, so I think this is where you need to start looking and reading into more of this. There's also the Office of Small Businesses, the OSDBU, Office of Small Disadvantaged Businesses, and they can also help with navigation. That is part of their remit, is to help smaller companies navigate opportunities at the Department of Energy, and that is led by Ron Pierce. So that's another place that folks can go, and they can help you figure out how to navigate and where to navigate.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you for that. So I want to, I'm resisting going through all the questions I prepared for you, by the way, because we just don't, I could talk to you for about 7 hours if I did, but there's something that really intrigues me. I mean, you've kind of referred to it in our conversation, but I want to get a little more specific. because I'm an innovation freak and I come from a long line of innovators, I might have told you, or you might have seen in your background research on me. Um, and I'm fascinated. I too have a varied background in different industries, but you've had your hands in medical and consumer as an entrepreneur and investing and in energy, etc. How does how does working in different industries affect your strategy for innovating and commercializing energy and infrastructure? How does it change your thinking or the way you assess opportunities or markets?
Great question. And one of the things I loved about consulting was I got a chance to see every single industry out there. We've been at McKinsey for 13 years. You get a chance to see it all. And there's a lot of learnings between industries that you can really glean from. And there's also things which are identical when you look at different industries. I think earlier when I talked about the PhD mindset, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, it's rampant because how we train PhDs is the same across the entire world. And so any industry you're in, you're going to see that mindset. And so the work that I've done over the years helping very large companies commercialize their technologies was in all industries, like from pharma, consumer electronics, all the things that you talked about. And I think really understanding how different industries approach things when there are commonalities is actually really helpful because it pares down the things that really matter. And to be perfectly blunt, it's actually really simple. It goes down to 3 questions that matter when you're trying to commercialize something. And it could be like my tangle-free headphones I commercialize on QVC or hydrogen hubs, which couldn't be more different. But the first is, are you inventing something that someone actually cares about? Second, can you sell it at a price that people are willing to pay for it? And third, can you deliver it at a cost where every single player along the value chain can make money? That is really at the most basic, the questions that you have to answer. And, there are times when I've had clients say, hey, I have this, newfangled thing that gives this functionality, but guess what? The customers don't care about it. Right? Or they're not going to pay what you think they need to pay for it. And so in the end, that's what it boils down to, is those 3 pretty simple questions. And if you can't answer yes at the top on those ones, then these other things that I worry about adoption readiness doesn't matter. Because if those 3 things can't be fulfilled, this other stuff just doesn't make any sense. And I can't tell you how many times as a venture capital person, as an entrepreneur, as an angel investor and a mentor, people can't articulate those 3 questions and the answers to them.
And to me, those are really at the core of adoption, managing adoption risk, really. I mean, and it goes to the lean startup methodology. I'm in an ICAP program, for example. I'm in the lean startup methodology of doing your customer discovery and getting constant feedback and tweaking, et cetera. So before I let you get back to changing our energy infrastructure, I like to give career advice to mid-career women. So what I'm talking about is a woman who has, let's say, 15 years of experience, who wants to use her education and her experience to make a difference. She wants to make money. She's ambitious. Maybe she wants to be you or the secretary or whoever, or run McKinsey someday, or who knows. But she wants to make money, but she wants to make a difference. So what advice would you give to her?
So I'm going to caveat that this is Vanessa Chan's advice, and what worked for me may not work for you. So this is not the truth. And hopefully, I think I'll be your 416th podcast guest. So hopefully across all of them, your listeners will find someone that really resonates. But I'll tell you kind of how I thought about things, and maybe someone has a similar signature may want to do something similar. I think first and foremost, making money, and this starts pretty early, but if you haven't started now, you might as well, is always live below your means. I cannot say that enough. My late husband and I, we shared a house where the 4 of us, including 2 kids, shared a bathroom. and this was when I was a McKinsey partner and he was in the senior executive, and the four of us shared a bathroom until 8 years ago, which meant that we could bank all our money, which gave us huge financial flexibility going forward, which means you can take more risks, right? And for me, that was important because my husband died prematurely. But luckily, because we had this financial flexibility, I didn't have to leave the job I'm in right now because of the fact that I have that financial flexibility. I think second is really be willing to follow a North Star that matters to you and no one else. And so my North Star has always been, am I interested in what am I doing and am I learning? And so when I left McKinsey, I was frustrated because I was kind of doing the same thing over and over again. Granted, it was like slightly different industries, doing innovation, all that, but it was still, I was doing PowerPoints, doing things, helping teams and all of that. I actually got a job offer to be CTO at a really large company, which would be one of the things where first Asian woman at this Fortune 100 company and as I was interviewing and kind of negotiating my offer with the CEO, I was like, I don't want this job. This is big America corporation, right? Which is not that dissimilar from McKinsey. And I'm not going to learn anything new here. And at the time, my kids were 7 and 9, and my 9-year-old invention that she was trying to bring to market. And I was like, this is crazy. I think our kids need to be more entrepreneurial. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm a McKinsey partner. So what if I try to do that? And so that's why I decided to launch a bunch of my consumer product inventions with the goal of trying to get on QVC. And people thought I was nuts because they're like, have you lost the plot? Why would you do this? You're getting this like Wall Street Journal article and you're now going to go do a Kickstarter campaign. Are you okay? But for me, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to learn so much. I'm going to learn about social media. I'm going to learn about branding, all the stuff. And I'm going to, put my kids on my board so they can kind of learn along the way with me and just see what happens. And I was like, I will always be a former McKinsey partner. I gave myself 2 years to try to do this. And I was like, worst case scenario, I completely implode, but I'll have so much more learnings than if I did 2 years and made a bunch of money in a private sector job. And then I think the third thing I would also tell people is always say yes, even if it's a partial yes. So I became a professor because Penn had asked me to, if I wanted to teach as a professor of practice. I said, sure, I'll add to my portfolio of my startup and also angel investing and public speaking. And I was teaching 2 classes, and in 2018, a former client of mine called me and was like, hey, Department of Energy is wanting to think about commercialization. I told them, you have to talk to Vanessa Chan. She knows commercialization cold, and she really is the person. So I spoke to someone from Department of Energy, and she's like, we're having a workshop in DC in a few months. Can you come down for it? And at the time, my husband he was the head of energy, waste, and Walmart in Arkansas for Walmart. So he was in Arkansas from Monday to Thursday while I was teaching at Penn and doing my things. I had the kids, right? So I'm like, I would love to, but I can't come for the full time because my husband's traveling right now. If I had given him enough advance notice, he was always very good about making sure that I could do what I needed, and we figured that out. But in this circumstance, he couldn't come back in time. And I was like, I'll come for a few hours and kind of share my thoughts. And I'm not a wallflower. So yeah. I was pretty open about everything that I said. So then fast forward to 2020, and I get this cryptic email saying the Biden-Harris administration is interested in you for a position. I was like, what are you guys talking about? I've never donated money. I've never served in government. This is not on my vision board. My vision board had a lot of things like QVC, but did not have the federal government. And I was like, I wonder where they found me. And I found out it was this woman who led the workshop was the one who threw my name in the hat. So if I had not gone to this half-day workshop years earlier, I would not be in the role I am right now. And so I think it's really easy, especially for working parents, to say, I can't do this. It doesn't fit in it. How's it going to help me now? But I actually did, because I was curious, what is it going to mean when it comes to, the DOE and the things that they're doing there? Because I'd never, worked in that space before. My dog is completely agreeing, if you can hear him.
I know, I can hear. I'm a dog person, so I love it, by the way. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that's really what, I think is really important, is always give a partial yes. I think you never know what's going to take you. And if I had not done that, I would not be here having this interview with you right now.
Well, and that's it. I was wondering what you were going to say about the partial yes. What was funny was you said always give a yes, even if it's a partial yes, right on the heels of telling me that you turned down the CTO job of a big company. So I was like, you said no
but that
to
was
them.
a choice I made, which was because I wasn't learning. So my North Star is, am I learning?
I understand.
Right.
It was
So that's where a lot of things, yeah, and that's where you kind of figure out what's the primary thing. But I will say my North Star always is, am I having fun and learning something new? If I'm not, it's time to go.
Well, it's interesting you say that because that's how I got my job at Chrysler. I mean, I'd never worked in the car business. If I didn't live where they were. I didn't even know who I was talking to at the time. And if they had posted a job and I had applied for it, they would never know my name because their applicant tracking system would have screened me out. Instead, the president of the company ended up recruiting me personally. We did hockey stick growth because I came in with quote unquote crazy ideas because I wasn't limited by this is the way we always do it in the car business. I came in and said, well, what if we do methane free Christmas? And what if we do partnerships with real estate developers and other entities for putting cars in their neighborhood, is with the properties. And they looked at me like had swallowed acid, but we ended up going and getting, on the cover of everywhere. So you have to be willing to take. And when I took this job, they moved me to Fargo, North Dakota, by the way, and I'm a New York City born and bred girl in DC. I'm an urban creature, and so my friends thought I needed a frontal lobotomy. But and needless to say, I was a fish out of I stuck out. Let's just say.
But didn't you grow so much in that?
Oh my God!
You learn, and that's the thing. Go somewhere which is super uncomfortable because you have no idea what you're going to learn.
Well, exactly. And that's how I got into the space now that I'm talking to you, because it catapulted me into the clean energy economy. And I've been there ever since. So I love it.
16 episodes later, here we are.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. So, Dr. Vanessa, you're magical. You're amazing. Thank you for the service to the country. Thank you for what you do every day. I will let you get back to your life. Any final thoughts before I let you go back to changing our world?
No, other than go to liftoff.energy.gov. You knew I had to put it in there. But thank you for taking the time. And I can't wait to get that drink with you at some point.
Yes, absolutely. And I will also say they should go to what do you call it? The Office of
Technology Transitions. Oh, the OSDBIS. Yeah, Office of Small Businesses. Yes, OSDBIS.
Yes. I think I did some work with them too. I know Trina Bilal very well.
Awesome.
She's magical. So join me in thanking Dr. Vanessa Chan of the Department of Energy for joining us today on Electric Ladies podcast. So thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Where do you want to see the Department of Energy funding go? Do you have a cool invention? Are you going to propose it to the Department of Energy? Post it to us on Twitter or Threads at Joan Michelson. Send us any questions there as well, including for Dr. Vanessa. And you may win a 30-minute coaching session with me. And please subscribe to our mailing list to stay abreast of our amazing, remarkable guests like Vanessa Chan, our articles and career advice. And you can do so on electricladiespodcast.com. I'm Joan Michelson. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.